Chapter 18. This particular chapter is kind of interesting in the fact that not only is Absalom defeated, but we also begin to see David's reaction to Absalom's death and the effect that it has upon the nation of Israel. And as we get into chapter 19, we'll see how Joab pretty much rebukes David for his reactions over the death of his son. So when it comes down to it, I guess when you're a leader of a nation and you have family concerns, sometimes the nation itself becomes more important than the family. And in this particular case, we see that. But at any rate, David is faced with Absalom's ultimate overtaking of the throne, and we'll see how that is dealt with. When we look at the particular chapter, we see not a whole lot of main characters, but we do see several. We see that David has three of his captains that he has over his army. And David's army, just on the outset, is severely outnumbered. We do know at the end of the battle that Absalom lost 20,000 men, so his army was probably much greater than that. And when David numbered his people, he only had 4,000. So we're probably looking at 5-to-1 odds in Absalom's favor. And controlled my eye this morning. But anyway, David takes his army and he divides them, and he puts three captains over the army. He has Joab, Abishai, the son of Zeruiah. Then you have Ittai, the Gittite. And then we'll see the two runners. We have the Himaez, which was the son of Zadok, which takes the message back to David, as well as the Cushite. And then, of course, we see Absalom himself. And then the locations, there's only two locations in this particular book. Actually, there's three. But we have the woods of Ephraim and Mahanaim. Now, David, as we know, has left Jerusalem, went to Mahanaim, which was where Ishbosheth had his capital at. So when I got to looking at this, I kind of assumed that the Israelites, the 10 tribes, kind of looked at this particular city as their capital city. And the fact that David went there, I think, meant quite a bit to them. And we'll see the outcome of that in the next chapter. But as we know, that Absalom, after he got his army together from all over Israel, he went and he camped in Gilead in preparation for the war. Now, when we look at the particular chapter, we see it broke down in these divisions. In the first 5 verses, we see that David divides his forces and assigns his captains over them. Then 6-8, we see that David's army routs Absalom's forces. And then 9-10, we see Absalom gets tangled in a tree, a terebinth tree. And then in 11-13, a man who finds Absalom tells Joab that he refuses to kill the king's son. In 14 and 15, we see Absalom is the one who kills him, and his armor bearers finish up the work for him. And then 16-32, we see the messengers that tell David about the battle and the death of his son. And then finally, in the last verse, we see David begins his mourning for Absalom. Now, when we look at this, let me get my pencil here. I have to get my pointer. When we look at this particular map, we see, let me get back to it. This thing works about as well as I do. There we go. We see that when we had mentioned Hushai's advice to Absalom to take, to assemble his army from Beersheba all the way up to Dan, we see that we're told that he's camped in the region of Gilead. Now, Gilead is quite a bit of an extended territory, so somewhere's up in here he encamps his army of 20,000 plus people. And we're not really sure where it was at, and some, commentators there, over the last hundreds of years, they've kind of argued back and forth about where this particular battle took place. Now, I had this map up last Wednesday night, but I want to take another look at it. The text tells us that Joab places his army in the Great Plain facing Joab. Now, he also says that he, let's see, in verse, where's it at? In verse 6, he says he went out into the field of battle, and the battle was in the woods of Ephraim. Now, there's two trains of thoughts in this, and I want to kind of bring both of these out to you. There's an area right above Mahanaim that is referred to as the forest of Ephraim. And over in the nation of Ephraim itself, or the territory that was given to the tribe of Ephraim, there's also a great forest. And some commentators say, and I think David Pratt kind of follows the same train of thought, is that the battle happened down here, and Joab's army was driven back into Ephraim, into this particular forest. I tend to think that it happened right up in here someplace. And the reason why is that when you look at what Josephus says about it, he says that Joab put his army against the enemy in the Great Plain where he had woods behind him. Now, if the woods were behind him, and if Absalom had encamped down here, then at least a third of the army had to encircle back over here and leave the city itself vulnerable to the attack of Absalom's army. So instead of having 4,000 people over there, he'd probably have around 3,000 or so to protect this city, which I don't think is a very smart military move. And when you look at verse 23, it says the runners, when they went back to tell David about the outcome of the battle, it says that the Cushite ran to Mahanaim, but he also says that Ahimaaz ran down by the plain. I think that's what it said. Let me get over there. It said, let me run. See. But he ran by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite. Now, if the Cushite was in the field of battle, if both of them were in the field of battle, the Cushite probably would have took the most direct route, which would have been across rough terrain. Whereas if Ahimaaz took the plain, then he would just made a quick jump over here, ran down this plain and crossed back over, and he could have outran him. Now, if the battle would have happened down here, it wouldn't have made much sense because we have a plain area all the way back up to Mahanaim, and both of them would have taken the plain. So the idea that the battle happened in this particular area of Gilead, to me, doesn't make a lot of sense, either from a military standpoint and from a standpoint that both of them could have taken the easier route, which would have been right up through here. So I tend to think that the battle might have happened right up in this particular area. And you may have a different viewpoint on that, but that's kind of my train of thought on that. So, be that as it may. Now, the next thing I wanted to show you was a terebinth tree. We were told that Absalom's mule ran up underneath this tree and he got his hair caught. And as we saw before, he only cut his hair once a year, and the weight of his hair was about 5 pounds. So he probably was a bushy, thick-headed kind of guy, and this is what that particular tree looks like. And to make matters even worse for Absalom, that's what the branches look like. So, when you run up underneath it, it's, they're just not tree branches that sticks out, but these things got, pointed needles to them, so it's very easy for his hair to get entangled up underneath it. So I thought that might be interesting for you to look at and to know. So let's take a look at the chapter. Turn the page. There we go. Now, as we said before, Absalom had a force greater than 20,000 people, because the text tells us later on, as we'll see, that he lost 20,000 people in this particular battle. When we begin chapter 19, it says, chapter 18 rather, it says, and David numbered the people who were with them and set captains of thousands and captains of hundreds over them. And then David sent out 1/3 of the people under the hand of Joab, 1/3 under the hand of Abishai, and the son of Zeruiah, and Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the hand of Ittai, the Gittite. And the king said to the people, I surely will go out with you. So when we divide 4,000 people up underneath three men, there's just a little over 1,000 people in each particular group. So with the 3 separate armies, they had 3 points of attack that they could make against Absalom. Now, not knowing how Absalom had set up his army, or at least Amasa had set up the army, now that he was in control of it, we're not sure how well they were dispersed. But one thing we do know is that Joab took the initiative in this particular battle, because he felt like that if he were to wait for Absalom to attack, then they would be in a defensive position and they would be in a lot worse condition. But with 3 separate armies, if they came in and attacked him at once when trying to catch him unprepared, they would have a better outcome. And the fact that Joab had placed his army between Absalom's in the woods kind of gave him an advantage, because if things were to go bad, they would fall back into protection of the woods, and if they followed into the woods, then they would have a better chance of attacking them. Now, when you have a large army like Absalom, you have to understand that these were not always all foot soldiers. We probably had men that were on horseback, you probably had chariots and what have you. And these people would not have the advantage in the wooded area. They would have an advantage in the plain, but they wouldn't have rough terrain or wood advantage. And I think Joab knew that and took advantage of his surroundings. Now, when David said that he himself would go out, he said that he would not. The people said, don't. The people in the city said, we want you to stay here with us. Because if you go out into the field of battle, then we are left with the assurance that if you're defeated, what's going to stop Absalom from taking his revenge out upon us? But if you are here, and if he's following the advice of Ahithophel about just going after David, then we pretty much have a bargaining chip. You can use yourself to protect the city, and you would be of more value to us than you would be on the field. And I think David saw the advantage of that. Why endanger the people that have taken you in and done so much for you in your time of need, to put them in unneeded danger if things were to go bad for him? So I think he, based on that, decided to stay. And I think too, his age may have also played a lot into it. As we said, it was towards the end of his life when these things were happening. And I don't think his strength on the battlefield would be of much value. And he says, whatever the king said, whatever seems best to you, I will do. So he stood beside the gate, and as the people went out, the king told the generals and the people that were going out with him, he said, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave the captain's orders concerning Absalom. In other words, don't harm this young man. If he's captured, please try to capture him in battle and bring him back to us. So they went out in the field of battle in verse 6. Battle was in the woods of Ephraim, and the people of Israel were overthrown and before the servants of David. And a great slaughter of 20,000 took place there that day. For the battle there was scattered over the face of the whole countryside, and the woods devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. So what the text is saying here is that the battle was happening really in 2 places, that in the field and that which was in the woods. And the people in the woods were having a much more difficult time than those that were in the field. And so I think Joab was wise in this decision. Absalom was probably the one that had faced off with Joab and was the one that his particular part of the army was taking the worst beating. Now Absalom met the servants of David, and David and Absalom. Okay, after they were meeting the defeat in the woods, in verse 9 it says that he met the servants of David, and Absalom rode on a mule, and the mule went under the thick boughs of a great terebinth tree, and his head caught in the terebinth, so he was hanging between heaven and earth. And the mule which was underneath him kept going. Now a certain servant saw it and told Joab and said, I saw Absalom hanging in a terebinth tree. Now, when I was thinking about this, one thing came to mind was, here you are fleeing from the general, the army that's trying to kill you, and you're caught up in this tree with your hair. Why wouldn't you try to cut yourself loose? You know, most warriors, besides having a sword or whatever they may be fighting with, always carried a knife. At least they should have. Why couldn't have Absalom taken his knife and tried to cut his hair loose to get him out of the tree? Two things came to my mind was either he didn't have a knife, or he wasn't smart enough to do that, or maybe his vanity stood in the way that I'm not going to cut my hair, I'm going to try to pull myself loose. But whatever it may be, he was not able to get loose. He wasn't probably smart enough to cut himself loose, or he didn't have the knife to do so. So after Joab was told that he was in the tree, his first reaction was, why didn't you kill him? You know, I would have given you 30 pieces of silver and a belt. I don't know what significance a belt is, unless it's just a symbol of, you know, like pinning a medal on your chest for doing something brave. He says, why didn't you kill him? You know, he was there, he's vulnerable, he was at your mercy. But the man had enough intelligence and enough dignity to understand that the king's request and the king's demands overruled what the commander of the army wanted to do. And this, really, when you stop and think about it, when David told him not to harm Absalom, kind of handicapped Absalom's ability to wage the war, because he knew that once the king was either captured or dead, preferably dead, then why would the army fight? And he also knew that the army that Absalom had assembled was not necessarily all battle-hardened people. I'm sure that, you know, vast majority were, but a lot of them were probably just people that they had conscripted through the nation, that were fathers, farmers, and people that would prefer not to fight, but they were probably coaxed into doing this. And so they were kind of handicapped by this request from David. And Joab just flat out ignored what David had said. But he said to the man in verse 12, he said, though I had, or rather the man had told Joab, he said, if I even were given 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, I would not raise my hand against the king's son. He had enough intelligence to know that what King David had requested, he said, I'm not going to go against his request. Second thing is, I'm not going to be the one guilty of killing a king's son. He said, that would be the worst thing that would happen to me, to be the one pointed out as being the one that killed the king's son. Whether he was a bad one or a good one, he said, I'm not going to do it. For in our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, beware lest anyone touch the young man Absalom. Otherwise, I would be dealt with falsely against my own life, for there is nothing hidden from the king. You know, word's going to get back to the king, who was the one that killed my son. And I'm not going to let that happen. So that you can't hide anything from David. And he said, even that, he said, if David were to question you, why was my son killed? In other words, you're going to cover your own self. You're not going to point the finger at you. You're going to point the finger at me and say, I'm the one that killed him. So you know, you can give me 1,000 pieces of shekels of silver, but I'm not going to kill this king's son. I mean, there is nothing that's going to protect me from the revenge of David, should I do it. And then while he was telling us all this, Job said, I can't linger with you. In other words, I don't have time for this. He said, I gotta get this guy. And he took 3 spears in his hand, and he thrust them through Absalom's heart while he was still alive in the midst of the terebinth tree. Now, assuming that this did not kill him, the 10 young men who wore his armor surrounded Absalom and struck and killed him. So evidently what Joab had done was not enough to kill Absalom. But by the time they got finished, he was dead, hanging in a tree. So Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel. For Joab held back the people from the onslaught. In other words, now that your king Absalom has died, we're not going to continue this war, so pull back. So I'm assuming whatever sound of the trumpet that they blew, everybody in the nation of Israel knew that Absalom had died and the battle was basically over. Why should they continue to fight for a king that's no longer alive to take over the rule of the nation? You're fighting for no reason other than just to kill other people. And then you're left without a king. So they understood what it meant. And so they held back, and the people stopped their fighting. And they took Absalom and cast him in a large pit in the woods and laid a very large heap of stones over him. And then all Israel fled everywhere to his tent. Now this is, I think, significant too, because once Absalom had been killed, they didn't give him a kingly burial. They treated him like a common thief and a common robber. They just threw him in a pit, piled a bunch of heavy stones upon him, to the extent that if they were to try to retrieve the body, it was going to be a lot of effort to do so. And they left him there, and they went about their way. They didn't give him any kind of kingly burial. And this, I think, was showing Joab's abhorrence to Absalom for what he had done to Israel, and no use for the destruction that he brought upon the nation. And he acted out really in his own accord by doing what he had done. He not only killed his son, but now he cast him off as a common robber. And this may have been for the best benefit of Israel, maybe not. Trying to unite the nation back under David because of this would have been difficult if the people were truly in line with Absalom. So this was Joab's decision to do that. It says, now Absalom in his lifetime had set up a pillar for himself, which was in the king's valley, for he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. And he called the pillar after his name, and to this day it is called Absalom's monument. So at the time this book was written, the monument was still standing. And he did this pretty much in his own vainglory, because there was no one to remember him for the deeds that he had done. It says that he had no son, but we saw back in earlier chapters that he did have 3 sons and 1 daughter. So we can assume that the 3 sons had been either died or killed in battle. We don't know. We just don't know that they no longer were alive. So he had nothing to remember him by, so in his own vanity he sets up this monument, and so that people can remember what he did for Israel. And when people will look at this, they should remember exactly what he did for Israel. He tried to usurp the throne from his father. He tried to kill his own father. He committed fornication with his father's wives. And on top of that, he took 20,000 plus Israelites to their death just to try to put himself on the throne. When you look at something like that, that's what you need to try to remember. And but Absalom wanted to be remembered for something else, and that was evidently to be a great leader. Now, when the battle was over, and after he was buried, the news had to be taken back to David about the outcome of the war. Now, Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, who was the priest, wanted to be the one to run back to David and tell him the news. And Joab said, you shall not take the news this day, for you shall take the news another day. In other words, this is not going to be your responsibility. I'm going to give it to someone else. Don't know why Joab made that decision, other than the fact that maybe he didn't want someone that was close to David to be the one to reveal the news to him about the death of his son. So he tells the Cushite to go and to tell David. So he bowed himself to Joab and he ran. And then Ahimaaz continued to badger Joab. Said, I really want to take the news to David. And he said, what news do you have to take? So I've already sent the messenger. He's going to evidently beat you there before you have the time to reach it. So he gives in to him and he says, okay, run, do what you want to. And so he took off and ran. And because of the path that he took down by the plains, instead of maybe over the rough terrain, he was able to outrun the Cushite. He gets to David, and as David was sitting between the gates waiting for word from the war, the watchman on the roof sees the runner coming. And I guess by the way he's running, he was able to identify that this was Ahimaaz, because I guess the way his stride is, I don't know. But he also identifies a second one coming. But he says, when Ahimaaz comes to the king said, he's a good man, he brings good news, and as he comes, he called out and said to the king, all is well. And then he bows himself down before the king to the earth. And the king said, blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered you, delivered up the men who raised their hand against you, my lord the king. So pretty much what Ahimaaz is telling him is that those that have raised your hand, those that have brought war to you, is no longer your adversaries. They have been delivered up into our hands. The king says, how's my son? Is the young man Absalom safe? You know, it seems like when the outcome of the war, it's like, of what value is more important, the value of the life of your son, the safety of your son, or the onslaught that may have been against the nation of Israel that was fighting for your cause. But he was really interested in whether or not Absalom was saved. He seemed to be obsessed by this, and we'll see that as we go into the next chapter. And then he says, I saw a great tumult, but I do not know what it was about. So he was kind of afraid to tell David that his son was dead. So he avoided it altogether, pretty much. I know what happened, but I'm not going to reveal that to you. There's another runner coming. And then he said, turn aside here, let's see what this other fellow has to say. And just then the Cushite came and said, there's good news, my lord the king, for the Lord has avenged you this day, all those who rose up against you. So again, the same news. You've been avenged by your generals, and your army has avenged you, and being able to overcome Absalom and his army. And then he asked the Cushite the same question. Is the young man Absalom safe? And the Cushite really used a lot of, I think, discrepancy in this. I think he used a little bit of intelligence, just not to come out and blurt it out to him, but he kind of poetically said it in a way that insinuated that he was not safe. He said, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise against you to do harm be like that young man. So now David understood that the armies that always have risen up against David has been put down, and any that may arise for him in the future with God's help will be put down. And so now he knows that Absalom was no longer alive. He didn't say he had died. He maybe insinuated that he's no longer a threat to you, but the king took it as the death of his son. He was deeply moved, and he went up in the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place, oh, Absalom, my son, my son. He really, really hated to see his son die. Now, it wasn't so much, I think, for the death of his son, but for the reason that his son had died. Because David understood, and probably has never forgotten, what God had said to him about his punishment concerning Bathsheba, that the sword would never leave his family. And now he's beginning to see the justice of that punishment. Even though God had forgiven him of his sins, he still had to face the consequences of his actions. His own son rose up against him. The sword was in his house. The sword sought his life, and now his son died by the sword. And as we saw now, David has already lost 2 sons within his own family. We don't know what happened to 3 others. There's nothing mentioned of them. But now he's lost 2 of them, and one of them was a very deeply moving death because of what this young man did. Like I said before, he not only tried to take his father's throne, he deceived him. He mistreated his concubines. He tried to kill his father, tried to take his life, and he did everything in the world that he could to punish David, to take what David had, and to put himself upon the throne of the nation. And God would not allow it. And the end result of all this, David was weeping because of the death of his son, but I think he's also weeping seeing that God's punishment to David is being fulfilled. And all of this that has happened, the wars, the death of the Israelites, the death of his son, was all because of the fact that he had committed a sin with another man's wife and had that man killed. And God has now taken his vengeance. And so David is mourning his son, and it gets even worse as we see in chapter 19. Now, I think that's all I had in that particular. What lessons can we learn from all this? Kind of hard to come up with some things, but I found 4 or 5. It says, when faced with unsurmountable odds, make your best preparations and place your trust in God. And that's what David was faced with. Probably a 6-to-1 odds in battle. Make your best preparations and then place your trust in God for the outcome. And then, like Absalom, don't become entangled with vanity. It can be your downfall. And a lot of people are like that. They become entangled in their pride, their vanity, or their own self-righteousness, and eventually it will be detrimental to them. Number 3, do what people ask of you, otherwise you can jeopardize your friendship. So, like Joab, when you go against what David's wishes were, you could jeopardize your relationship with that particular person. And we'll see in chapter 19 that Joab, who was the commander of the army, no longer is commander of the army. And there's a couple of good reasons for that, and we'll see that next Sunday. It says, be compassionate when you have to tell someone bad news. Don't be blunt, straight to the point. Sometimes you have to be diplomatic in the way you say things. Otherwise, you could really do a lot of damage to another person's feelings. And then bear your losses gracefully and always consider what others have done for you. David, I think, had a hard time trying to bear this news in a graceful manner, because the end result, and we'll see that in chapter 19, is that he did not consider what the nation had done for him to overcome the threat of Absalom and to restore himself back to the throne. So chapter 18 is really bringing to the end of what happened to Absalom's effort to take the throne, the creation of a civil war within the nation. And now David is in a position where he's severely hurt, he's mourning, and now the effort is trying to reunite the 10 northern tribes and Judah together in as a united nation. And David is having difficulty realizing the importance of that. And again, we'll see in chapter 19 where Joab is trying to do some damage control in this particular situation. Joab, for what he was worth, he was a ruthless individual, but he always seemed to try to do what was best for the nation, and keeping it under control, trying to keep it united, and try to keep its greatness underneath David. And even though he did some things that were really questionable, I think the intent of his heart was in that direction. Anyway, any questions or comments?
Not so much, but that Ephraim, on that map you showed was here, but then the forest was way further away. Why would it be? Was Ephraim
think that's just a name that they had given to it, yeah. I was trying to remember, Keelan Dealish had went into some discussion about, why it was called that, and I forget now what it was, but I think it's just an arbitrary name given to them. Might have been some, I'll have to go back and look, but it may have had something to do with the possession of the land, was not, underneath Joshua's guidance was not enough to, for the tribe of Ephraim to have, so they might have moved, to another location. I think that might have had something to do with it. I'll be honest with you, I remember talking about it, but I don't know. It's just a name given to it.
Another thought that just came to my mind about Absalom and the tree is, why didn't he have other soldiers from his army around him that would have cut him down? I guess we don't know.
Yeah, I think that shows the true leadership of Absalom, in that he, when the fighting got fierce, he was not up to the fight, and I think he just turned tail and ran without anyone to guard him, or at least was smart enough to grab 2 or 3 people to go with him. So that may be the answer to that. It's kind of like out at the plant, we used to have these horrendous decomps in our high pressure units, and it would just scare you to death. And you wouldn't have time to think about the people around you. When you heard one, you ran as fast as you could in the opposite direction. So I can kind of understand Absalom, when he got scared, he probably ran without thinking about who was around him and what he could do to protect himself. Anything else? Okay, Rodney's going to teach the class Wednesday night, and like I said, I think he's teaching on how to identify false teachers in Bible classes. And so I don't know what he's going to teach on, but I do appreciate him filling in for me. But I'll be back next Sunday, and we'll pick up on chapter 19 unless he decides he wants to do chapter 19. So anyway, I appreciate y'all's attention and thought. Hopefully we've had a good study.